right now, underneath the dirt in Queensland, Australia is basically pumping out millions of barrels of its own really high-quality oil.
Yeah, a massive amount of it.
But at this exact moment, we're looking at April 2026, over 200 rural petrol stations across the country are just, well, they're completely dry.
Completely empty. Zero diesel at the pumps.
Right. And farmers are paying nearly $3 a liter just to turn their tractors on. And the heavy freight networks, the ones that actually stock the supermarket shelves for you, they are teetering on the edge of total collapse.
It's a surreal contradiction.
It really is. I mean, you are looking at a country that is somehow starving for fuel while, simultaneously choking on its own oil.
The contradiction is just staggering when you look at the raw data. The situation on the ground has really moved past a standard supply chain headache.
Yeah.
We're looking at a genuine threat to sovereign capability here.
Right.
We're seeing the actual physical limits of the national infrastructure just breaking under pressure.
So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are tearing into a massive stack of sources for you. Primarily, this really comprehensive April 2026 research report that details the origins, the triggers, and the long-term fallout of Australia's current fuel shortage.
It's a heavy report.
Oh, totally. And our mission today is to dissect the incredible policy trade-offs happening right now, specifically between pursuing national energy security and attempting to meet these strict net zero climate goals.
Right, the collision of those two priorities.
Exactly. We're going to pull apart how a sudden geopolitical shock completely exposed over 20 years of structural vulnerability.
And the analytical framework we really need to establish for you right from the start is that the empty pumps and the inflated prices, they're just the lagging indicators.
They're just the symptoms.
Exactly. The actual root cause is this deeply complex collision of global over-reliance, profound domestic economic shifts, and a regulatory landscape that fundamentally altered how the nation handles its own energy.
It's a huge mess.
It really is. Sovereign survival is currently crashing headfirst into long-term climate strategies, and, well, neither side can easily yield.
Yeah, and the scale of this crisis is just hard to overstate. I mean, reports confirm that anywhere from 170 to 205 petrol stations, specifically out in rural and regional hubs, have zero diesel. Zero.
Which is terrifying for those communities.
Right. And where fuel actually is flowing, panic buying has shoved the retail price of diesel near that $3 mark, and regular unleaded is sitting well over $2.50.
And the cascading effect of those prices is immediate. You look at the heavy logistics sector, the trucks hauling refrigerated food, medical supplies, construction materials.
It's stuff you rely on every day.
Yeah, they operate on incredibly thin margins. So when their primary input cost doubles, that cost is instantly passed down the line to you.
Naturally.
Furthermore, the massive agricultural planting season is heavily dependent on diesel machinery. And the mining sector in the Pilbara, which essentially underwrites the entire Australian export economy, is facing critical operational bottlenecks.
Reading through these reports, a weird analogy came to mind.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It feels like a massive hospital administration deciding to just remove their backup diesel generators to save on annual maintenance costs.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Because they figure, hey, the municipal power grid is 99.9% reliable, so why pay for redundancy? It looks like a brilliant, super efficient cost-saving measure on a spreadsheet.
Right up until the exact moment a freak storm knocks out the city grid.
Exactly. Suddenly you have surgeons operating in the dark.
That captures the vulnerability of these just-in-time supply chains perfectly. A system optimized entirely for cost efficiency is, by definition, stripped of its shock absorbers.
It has no buffer.
None. So to understand how the Australian economy ended up operating in the dark, we have to examine the storm that knocked out the grid. And the immediate trigger that shattered the global supply chain didn't happen anywhere near Australian shores.
No, it was a total black swan event. The crisis kicked off thousands of kilometers away in late February 2026. This was following military strikes by the United States and Israel on Iran.
Right.
And in immediate retaliation, the Iranian government moved to block the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is massive.
Yeah.
The Strait of Hormuz is basically the central artery of the global hydrocarbon economy. It's a narrow maritime choke point between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
Just this tiny stretch of water.
Exactly. Under normal, peaceful conditions, roughly 20% of the world's total oil and liquefied natural gas flows through that specific corridor. It is the primary valve releasing the massive reserves of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq right into the global market.
I mean, we are talking about 1/5 of the entire planet's energy supply moving through a channel where the actual shipping lanes are, what, barely 2 miles wide in some places?
Barely 2 miles, yeah.
Yeah.
And the intelligence sources indicate that following the blockade, actual maritime traffic navigating the strait plummeted to around 5% of its normal volume.
Wait, 5%?
5%. Tanker companies simply cannot secure the marine insurance required to risk sailing a multi-million-dollar vessel loaded with highly flammable cargo into an active military blockade zone.
Wow. Yeah, I wouldn't want to insure that either.
No one would. The maritime insurance premiums just skyrocketed to completely unviable levels practically overnight.
Which, of course, instantly paralyzed global markets. Brent crude spiked to $126 of a barrel almost immediately.
And the physical reality of that price spike was raw material starvation. Refineries all across the globe, but most critically in Asia, rely on the continuous arrival of those massive crude carriers from the Middle East.
Right, they need that constant flow.
Exactly. When the ships stop arriving, those massive industrial complexes burn through their on-site reserves in a matter of days.
And this is exactly where the crisis physically lands on Australian shores, because Australia doesn't refine the vast majority of its own fuel anymore.
Not even close.
The notes show that the country currently imports about 90% of its finished fuel products. So the petrol in the cars, the diesel in the trucks, the jet fuel in the planes, it all comes from mega-refineries located in Singapore, South Korea, China, India, and Malaysia.
The integration is profound. It's a whole chain. The Middle East extracts the raw crude oil. They ship it to Asia. Asia utilizes its massive industrial capacity to refine that crude into finished, usable products.
And then they send it south.
Yes, Asia loads those finished products onto smaller product tankers and sails them down to storage terminals in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane.
But when the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, those Asian refineries lose their raw ingredients. And when a country's critical energy infrastructure is starved, they don't just, keep exporting what little they have out of the goodness of their heart.
Absolutely not. They immediately trigger sovereign protection protocols. The Asian refining hubs entered pure survival mode. Governments stepped in, implemented strict export restrictions, and mandated that the refineries hoard whatever finished products they could still produce.
Just saving it for themselves.
Exactly. Specifically for their own domestic populations and militaries. The international export market essentially evaporated.
So the ships scheduled to resupply Australia simply vanished from the maritime tracking boards. And that disappearance exposed some absolutely terrifying numbers regarding Australia's domestic fuel reserves.
The reserve data is grim.
Yeah, the sources detail the strategic reserve data as of mid-April 2026. For regular petrol, the country has about 38 to 39 days of supply just sitting in storage tanks.
Which is deeply concerning.
Yeah.
Especially given that the International Energy Agency, the IEA, mandates a minimum baseline of 90 days of net import coverage for its member nations.
So they're supposed to have 90, and they have 38.
Right. 38 days is a massive failure of strategic buffering.
But the diesel numbers are what actually stopped me in my tracks. Diesel reserves are sitting at just 29 to 31 days.
Just a month.
Yeah, it's a 30-day countdown to the heavy economy seizing up entirely. And what really shocks me in these notes is the disproportionate hit to diesel compared to regular petrol. Why did the Asian refineries specifically stop sending diesel? And why is the domestic shortage so heavily skewed toward it?
Well, the disparity comes down to a collision of domestic demand profiles and, believe it or not, organic chemistry.
Chemistry. Okay, break that down for me.
So first, on the demand side, Australia's geographical reality dictates its fuel consumption. It's a massive continent, heavily reliant on long-haul road freight, intensive mechanized agriculture, and massive earth-moving operations in those remote mining sectors.
Right, a lot of big machines.
Exactly. The national demand for diesel outstrips regular petrol by more than 2 to 1. Diesel does the heavy lifting for the entire GDP.
So petrol gets commuters from the suburbs to the office, but diesel moves the actual iron ore to the port and the wheat to the silo.
That is the economic reality, yeah.
Yeah.
But the second factor, the actual reason the Asian supply of diesel dried up so much faster than petrol, is rooted in the chemistry of the crude oil itself.
Okay.
Not all crude oil pulled from the earth is the same. The crude that flows out of the Middle East, the crude currently trapped behind that Hormuz blockade, is generally categorized as heavy and sour.
Meaning it has like a higher density and a higher sulfur content.
Yes. And crucially, that specific chemical composition, that long-chain hydrocarbon structure, makes Middle Eastern crude exceptionally well suited for refining into what the industry calls middle distillates.
And diesel falls into that category.
Diesel and jet fuel fall squarely into this category.
I see. So when you put heavy Middle Eastern crude into a distillation tower, the natural yield gives you a massive amount of diesel.
Exactly the dynamic. So when the Asian refineries lost access to that specific diesel-rich heavy crude, their physical ability to produce diesel plummeted faster than their ability to produce lighter fuels like petrol. They couldn't just substitute a different type of crude and get the exact same output. Refining is a game of molecular fractions. You can only extract what the raw material physically contains.
Wait, but what about the two tiny refineries that Australia still has operating locally? Ampol in Queensland and Viva in Victoria. Can't they just, tweak their machinery to pump out more diesel to fill the gap?
They really cannot. Those facilities have legacy operational designs that skew heavily toward producing petrol.
Of course they do.
Yeah, the catalytic cracking units and the distillation towers are physically calibrated for a specific output ratio. Re-engineering a refinery to drastically alter its yield from petrol to diesel requires massive capital upgrades and years of downtime. They are locked into their current production chemistry.
So the country is entirely dependent on heavy freight, mining, and agriculture sectors running exclusively on a fuel that we suddenly cannot import, cannot refine domestically in meaningful quantities, and have less than a month's supply of.
It's a perfect storm.
The obvious question for you listening is, how did a massive, wealthy nation allow itself to become so thoroughly dependent on a supply chain that could be choked off by a single naval maneuver on the other side of the planet?
Well, to map that out, we have to look past the immediate geopolitical shock. We have to examine the long-term policy and market choices of the last 20 years.
Because this wasn't an overnight accident.
No, not at all. The crisis in 2026 is the predictable culmination of a 2-decade-long process of deliberately hollowing out domestic refining capacity.
Yeah, the timeline of this decline in the source report is just brutal. If we look back to the year 2000, Australia actually had a highly robust domestic refining sector. There were about 8 massive refineries operating across the country, meeting roughly 70% of local demand.
Which is a massive strategic buffer.
70% self-sufficiency means that if the global supply chain stutters, the domestic economy barely notices. But that buffer was, as the sources show, systematically dismantled.
Right. The dominoes started falling early. In 2003, the Mobile Port Standback refinery in South Australia shut down. Then, between 2012 and 2013, the massive Shell Clyde refinery in New South Wales closed.
It just kept going.
Yeah. By 2014, the Caltex Kernel refinery, also in Sydney, and the BP Bulwer Island facility in Queensland were gone.
And the closures weren't just about losing the fuel output, right? It was the loss of thousands of highly skilled engineering jobs, dismantling massive industrial infrastructure, and the degradation of the surrounding petrochemical supply chains.
A huge loss of capability. And the final blows were delivered during the economic chaos of the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2021, the Viva Energy Quina refinery in Western Australia and the ExxonMobil Altona refinery in Victoria both ceased refining operations.
They just became import terminals.
Exactly, they converted into simple import terminals.
So that relentless sequence reduced the nation from 8 refineries providing 70% of the fuel down to just 2 remaining facilities, Ampol Lytton and Viva Geelong, which can barely cover 20% of the country's needs.
Pushing that critical import dependency up to the catastrophic 80 to 90% threshold.
Now, when I read that timeline, my first reaction is absolute bewilderment at the government. I mean, why didn't anyone step in? These are massive pieces of critical national security infrastructure. You don't just let them close down like a local retail shop.
The prevailing economic philosophy of the era really provides the context here. It wasn't government negligence in the sense of ignoring the problem.
It was on purpose.
It was an active, endorsed policy choice rooted in a deep belief in free market dynamics and the presumed infallibility of globalized supply chains.
Okay, I have to push back on the logic of that era, specifically the 2013 Energy White Paper mentioned in our sources.
Go ahead.
The architects of that paper explicitly argued that the closing of domestic refineries like Clyde and Kernel would not harm Australia's liquid fuel security. Their entire argument hinged on supply chain diversification.
Right, the idea of having multiple suppliers.
Yeah, they claimed that relying on imported finished products from multiple Asian mega-refineries was just as safe as importing raw crude to refine locally. But surely they realized that all those distinct Asian refineries relied on the exact same maritime choke points to get their crude. I mean, that isn't diversification, that's just an illusion of it.
Your critique highlights the exact flaw in their macroeconomic modeling. The policymakers conflated supplier diversification with geographic resilience.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, they saw that fuel was arriving from Singapore, South Korea, and Japan, and ticked the diversified box on the risk assessment. They completely ignored the upstream reality that all those nations were tethered to the Strait of Hormuz and the South China Sea.
So they were basically blinded by the spreadsheet.
Successive governments accepted this market-led logic simply because the finished fuel arriving from Asia was just cheaper than the fuel produced locally.
But the notes reveal a massive chemistry mismatch that makes the entire situation even more absurd. I mean, people constantly ask, Australia is resource rich, we have our own oil, why don't we just drill it and refine it ourselves?
It's the most common question.
Right, and the truth is, we do have oil. Massive amounts of it.
Australia possesses significant domestic petroleum resources, primarily located in offshore basins and certain onshore regions. But this is exactly where the strict realities of chemical engineering dictate economic viability.
Because the oil Australia extracts is predominantly light crude, or condensate. It has a very high API gravity, it is light, sweet, and has very low sulfur content.
Which makes it highly valuable.
Highly valuable on the global market. But those old domestic refineries that closed down, the ones built in the 1950s and 60s, they were physically engineered to process heavy, sour crude.
Yes. The metallurgical composition of their pipes, the temperature gradients of their distillation towers, the specific catalysts used in their cracking units. Everything was calibrated for the specific molecular weight of heavy Middle Eastern oil.
Which creates this unbelievable logistical loop.
Oh, it's wild.
For decades, Australia was extracting its own premium light crude oil. But because its own refineries couldn't efficiently process it, the country was forced to export its sovereign oil to the global market, only to turn around and import massive tankers of heavy crudes from the Middle East to feed its aging domestic facilities.
It was an incredibly inefficient cycle. You are paying freight costs to ship your oil out and paying freight costs to ship someone else's oil in.
It makes no sense.
And when you combine those compounding logistical expenses with the fact that these older Australian facilities were relatively small scale and required massive capital injections just to meet modern environmental and safety standards, the profit margins just vanished.
Especially when they were going head-to-head with the Asian mega-refineries. I mean, places like Zhong Island in Singapore aren't just refineries. They are massive, highly integrated petrochemical cities operating with economies of scale that are hard to comprehend.
Truly massive. And the shift to relying on those hyper-efficient Asian hubs transformed the Australian energy landscape into a pure just-in-time delivery model.
Right.
Efficiency optimization is ruthless. It views massive storage tanks full of reserve fuel as trapped capital. A highly efficient system minimizes storage and relies on a continuous, uninterrupted conveyor belt of arriving ships.
And as the hospital generator analogy showed us earlier, efficiency is the enemy of resilience. The strategic buffer was deemed economically inefficient to maintain.
Exactly.
Inventory dropped from hundreds of days of secure supply decades ago down to barely a month. And when a true geopolitical shock severs the conveyor belt, a just-in-time system has absolutely zero tolerance for the interruption.
The buffer is gone, and the shock travels straight to the retail consumer instantly.
Okay, so importing is a proven disaster in a crisis. The old refineries were too small, too old, and built for the wrong type of oil. The obvious answer seems staring us right in the face. Just build new ones?
If only it were that simple.
Right. Why hasn't a massive multinational, a BHP or a Rio Tinto, just spent the capital to build a brand new, state-of-the-art mega-refinery on the Queensland coast? One perfectly engineered to process our own sovereign light crude.
Because the very thing that gave the Australian economy the immense wealth to hypothetically fund such a project, the historic mining boom, is the exact mechanism that makes building it economically impossible.
And this brings us to a fascinating macroeconomic phenomenon detailed in the research called the Dutch disease. It sounds like an archaic agricultural plague, but it's pure economics.
Yeah, the term originated in the 1970s. It was used to describe the economic structural shift that occurred in the Netherlands after the discovery of massive natural gas fields in the North Sea.
Okay.
The sudden, massive influx of foreign capital from exporting that gas drastically drove up the value of the Dutch currency.
Which, on a surface level, sounds fantastic. A strong currency means your purchasing power parity goes up. Buying imported electronics or traveling overseas becomes incredibly cheap.
It is beneficial for consumers buying imports, sure, but it is deeply corrosive to domestic manufacturing and non-resource export sectors.
Why is that?
A hyper-valued currency makes everything you try to manufacture domestically and sell overseas uncompetitive. More critically, a massive resource boom acts like a vacuum for national resources.
It just sucks everything up.
Yes, the mining sector pulls in all available investment capital and sucks up the entire pool of skilled labor. Engineers, heavy machinery operators, welders, logistics experts, and they do it by offering astronomical wages.
Because they are pulling iron ore out of the ground at incredible margins, they can afford to pay a welder a massive premium to relocate to the Pilbara.
Precisely. That sets a new, deeply inflated baseline for industrial wages across the entire country. The Gregory thesis, which adapts the Dutch disease model specifically to the Australian context, highlights how this resource-driven wage inflation makes heavy manufacturing economically unviable.
Right.
If you want to build and operate a massive industrial facility like a mega-refinery in Australia, you have to compete directly with mining sector wages just to staff the site.
It is essentially like trying to run a massive discount dollar store, where your entire business model relies on moving high volumes at razor-thin margins, but you are forced by the local labor market to pay every single one of your cashiers and warehouse staff Wall Street investment banker bonuses.
That's a great comparison.
The math collapses immediately.
The cost squeeze is insurmountable. Downstream oil refining, the physical process of cracking crude into usable diesel, is not a high-margin business globally. It is fiercely competitive and highly cyclical. You make literal pennies per barrel, but you process hundreds of thousands of barrels a day.
But if your base operating expenses, your labor force, your industrial electricity rates, your initial construction capital are vastly higher than your international competitors, those pennies turn into negative numbers before the first drop of fuel is even refined.
This is exactly why any theoretical Australian mega-refinery simply cannot compete with the massive hubs in Asia. A facility in South Korea or Singapore benefits from highly integrated petrochemical clusters, massive government logistical support, and crucially, significantly lower baseline labor and compliance costs.
So they have every advantage.
Yeah. The research report models this explicitly. Australia's high labor costs and capital construction premiums make massive downstream refining operations fundamentally unsuitable for the domestic market without continuous massive injections of taxpayer subsidies.
Wait, let me challenge the modeling on that. Because we are factoring in the labor costs, but we are ignoring the raw material logistics.
Okay, how so?
We literally have the light crude oil sitting right there in the ground in places like the Cooper Basin. Doesn't the fact that you don't have to charter a massive tanker and sail the oil halfway across the globe offset the premium you pay for Australian labor? Shouldn't eliminating the massive maritime freight costs make local manufacturing cheaper overall?
It is a highly logical assumption. But when you run the actual unit economics at a mega scale, the math falls apart.
Really?
Yeah. The savings generated by eliminating raw material freight are entirely consumed and vastly exceeded by the sheer scale of the capital expenditure. The capex required to build a modern multi-billion-dollar refining facility from scratch is astronomical.
Ah, the upfront cost.
And furthermore, the ongoing operational expenditure, the premium for Australian labor, domestic energy inputs, and maintenance, creates a permanent drag on profitability. Without the immense scale of an Asian hub to amortize those costs, an Australian plant remains structurally uncompetitive.
So even if an energy consortium had $10 billion ready to deploy today, the pure economic forecasting would universally advise them to never build a massive traditional refinery on Australian soil.
The financial market signals all flash red. However, the economic barriers and high wages are only the first layer of the problem.
There's more. Oh, absolutely. Even if a company deliberately chose to ignore the economic warnings, perhaps a state-backed entity prioritizing sovereign capability over pure financial return, they would immediately smash into a massive, immovable regulatory and environmental wall. And this highlights the core regulatory paradox of this entire crisis. We are watching two completely valid, yet mutually exclusive national priorities collide in real time.
The legislative landscape detailed in the sources is incredibly complex. Australia has implemented stringent environmental regulations which are entirely necessary for ecological protection, obviously.
Right.
The primary federal legislation, the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, The EPBC Act mandates rigorous, exhaustive, and often incredibly lengthy approval processes for any massive new industrial project.
And the research notes specifically point out that long-promised reforms intended to streamline this exact act have faced massive bureaucratic delays. The regulatory hurdles are higher and more complicated than ever.
But the approval process is really just the beginning. The actual operational reality is governed by the safeguard mechanism.
Right, I've heard of that.
It's a foundational piece of the government's climate policy architecture. It legally places strict, declining caps on the total greenhouse gas emissions that large industrial facilities are permitted to produce.
And a mega-refinery is inherently and unavoidably a massive carbon emissions source. You are applying massive amounts of heat and pressure to hydrocarbons.
Under the rules of the safeguard mechanism, if a new fossil fuel refinery were miraculously built, it would be burdened with a massive carbon debt from the moment it turned on.
Because it's already over the cap.
Exactly. The facility would be legally mandated to drastically reduce its total emissions year over year. Since refining has a relatively fixed emissions floor based on the chemistry of the process, the company would be forced into the secondary market to purchase highly expensive carbon credit offsets just to remain legally compliant.
Which acts as a massive operational tax. It completely destroys whatever microscopic profit margin they might have retained after paying the inflated construction and labor costs.
The compliance costs are a structural barrier, no doubt. However, the most insurmountable hurdle is the timeline collision with the national net zero targets.
The report lays out the legal commitments clearly here. Australia is legally bound to achieve a massive 62 to 70% reduction in national emissions by the year 2035. And then absolute net zero emissions by the year 2050.
Now, overlay the timeline of building a mega refinery onto those targets. From the initial geological scoping and environmental impact statements, moving through capital raising, complex engineering design, global procurement, and actual physical construction, you are looking at a minimum lead time of 5 to 10 years before the facility produces its first drop of usable diesel.
So if a consortium miraculously secured the land, the permits, and the billions of dollars today in 2026, the plant wouldn't even open its doors until roughly 2035 or 2036.
The exact moment the country is legally committed to slashing its heavy emissions by 70%. This creates an absolutely unacceptable risk profile for any institutional investor. It's the guarantee of a stranded asset.
A stranded asset, meaning you deploy billions of dollars into a massive physical facility that the government effectively regulates out of existence or taxes into bankruptcy before you can even begin to pay off the initial capital debt.
Exactly. If the entire macroeconomic trajectory of the nation is locked into prioritizing renewable grid energy, the rapid electrification of the national vehicle fleet, and the transition of heavy industry toward green hydrogen, there is zero incentive for any private entity to invest massive capital into fossil fuel infrastructure.
Because it's explicitly designed by government policy to be obsolete in 2 decades.
Correct. You cannot legally mandate a rapid, aggressive phase-out of fossil fuels and simultaneously expect the private sector to spend billions of dollars building massive new fossil fuel factories. The paradox is absolute.
The government is trapped in the ultimate policy trade-off. They are caught between the immediate imperative of ensuring short-term sovereign survival, literally keeping the freight trucks running and the supermarket shelves stocked this week, and achieving long-term, legally binding climate goals.
It's an impossible position.
The regulatory framework, while entirely neutral and necessary in its intent to protect the environment, inadvertently locks the door on traditional, large-scale avenues of securing fuel sovereignty.
The constraints are incredibly tight.
Okay, let's look at the reality on the ground. We can't import enough diesel because the Strait of Hormuz is a war zone and Asia has locked down its exports.
Right.
We can't use our 2 old refineries to fill the gap because they process the wrong type of oil and can't shift their output chemistry. We can't build massive new refineries because Dutch disease makes the labor prohibitively expensive, and the net zero legislation makes them guaranteed stranded assets.
The box is completely sealed.
Yet the country hasn't entirely stopped. The trucks are still running, albeit at massive premiums. The mines in the outback are still pulling ore out of the ground. How is the industry utilizing the crude oil Australia does have without triggering all these economic and environmental landmines?
Well, necessity forces innovation. Because the massive, centralized mega-refinery model is entirely broken for Australia, the industry is pivoting to a radically decentralized approach, the micro-refining micro-solution.
This was the breakthrough moment in the research for me. Let's dig into what is happening out in the Tarim Trough in Queensland.
The Tarim Trough is a specific geological basin, and it represents a highly strategic new source of domestic petroleum. The field data indicates that operators, primarily Shell, are currently extracting around 200 barrels a day of very high-quality, ultralight crude oil condensate from this specific region.
Now, to put that in perspective for you, 200 barrels a day is nothing compared to the hundreds of thousands of barrels a massive Asian facility processes. It is a rounding error in global oil production.
Microscopically small. But the value isn't in the volume, it's in the logistics. Because of its ultralight chemical composition, it requires very little processing.
Which changes everything.
It does. Instead of loading that raw condensate onto a pipeline, pumping it to a coastal terminal, loading it onto a massive tanker, shipping it through contested waters to Singapore, paying a mega-refinery to process it, and shipping it all the way back.
It simply never leaves the outback.
Exactly. The raw crude is loaded directly into a specialized tanker truck and driven a relatively short distance to the IOR Eromanga refinery.
And Eromanga isn't some sprawling industrial complex with massive cooling towers. It's a micro-refinery.
It is a highly specialized, hyper-localized facility. Eromanga has a maximum processing capacity of just 1,250 barrels a day.
So tiny.
Very tiny. It bypasses the need for massive, complex catalytic cracking units. Its entire operational purpose is to take that specific, locally produced light condensate and use simple fractional distillation to refine it directly into diesel fuel.
And where does that freshly minted diesel go?
It goes straight into the fuel tanks of the local underground mining industry operating in the surrounding region. It creates a perfectly closed-loop economic model.
It is essentially the farm-to-table restaurant model, but applied to heavy industrial hydrocarbons. You drill the oil locally, you process it locally in a small facility, and you bring it locally in the massive dump trucks operating just a few towns over.
That's a perfect analogy.
It completely sidesteps the global supply chain, the geopolitics of the Middle East, the Asian mega-refineries, and the massive maritime freight premiums.
It is a brilliant, highly functional example of localized resilience.
Yeah.
By keeping the entire extraction, refining, and consumption chain onshore and geographically concentrated, they create an isolated bubble of sovereign energy security.
They're in their own little world.
Yeah. The mining operations running on Eromanga diesel are entirely insulated from the chaos. They don't care if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked or if Asian supply lines collapse.
This model seems like pure genius. If we have these onshore basins with light crude, why doesn't the government just incentivize stamping out 50 of these micro-refineries across the country? Can we scale this closed-loop model to save the entire national supply chain?
That is the pivotal question. And exploring it reveals the strict limitations of the technology. While micro-refining is an elegant, perfect solution for supplying remote, geographically concentrated heavy industries like inland mining or massive agricultural hubs, the mathematics of scale completely prohibit it from supplying major urban centers.
Break the math down for us. Why can't we just build a ring of 10 micro-refineries around the outskirts of Sydney and Melbourne to process our domestic oil?
It comes down to the sheer magnitude of urban energy density and the logistical nightmare of distribution. A major metropolitan center like Sydney, encompassing massive daily commuter traffic, deeply complex commercial freight networks, and a major international airport, consumes millions of liters of highly specific fuel blends every single day. A facility producing 12,050 barrels a day doesn't even make a dent in that demand profile.
It's like trying to hydrate a marathon with a single water dropper. The quality of the water might be pure, but the volume throughput is physically impossible.
Exactly. To supply a capital city using the micro-refining model, you would need to construct dozens, perhaps hundreds, of these small, decentralized facilities around the urban perimeter.
And people wouldn't want that.
No. The moment you attempt that, you slam right back into the environmental zoning laws. You face massive community opposition to placing industrial emission sites in residential backyards. Furthermore, the sheer logistical inefficiency of piping or trucking raw crude oil to 50 distinct microsites instead of one centralized mega-hub destroys any localized economic advantage.
So the reality is that micro-refining is a highly effective regional band-aid. It protects the remote industrial heart of the economy, which is vital for protecting national export revenues, but it is absolutely not a scalable national cure.
It's limited by design.
It leaves the millions of average citizens living in the populous coastal cities incredibly vulnerable to the empty pumps we're seeing today.
It secures the remote industrial periphery, but leave the urban core entirely exposed.
Which brings us to the most painful reality of this 2026 crisis. If micro-refineries cannot save the major cities, and the primary Asian supply line is severed by geopolitical conflict, where exactly is the Australian government getting the missing diesel right now to keep the urban supermarket logistics from collapsing entirely?
They are executing a massive emergency long-haul supply pivot, and it is a logistical and financial nightmare. Because the Asian market is paralyzed and hoarding its products, the Australian government has been forced to look across the massive expanse of the Pacific Ocean,
To the United States.
specifically the massive refining complexes along the U.S. Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana. The sources detail a critical emergency response mechanism that was recently activated by the federal government. They pushed through the Export Finance and Insurance Corporation Amendment.
It sounds incredibly dry and bureaucratic, but the implications are massive.
Its real-world impact is profound and immediate. This legislative amendment essentially allows the Australian federal government to step in and financially underwrite and guarantee the purchase of massive quantities of refined fuels directly from the international spot market.
So they're stepping in as a guarantor.
Yes, specifically targeting the U.S. and Mexico to completely bypass the frozen Asian supply chain.
So we are abandoning our geographical neighbors and buying diesel directly from Texas.
Yes.
Right.
And the physical reality of that purchase is staggering.
Yeah.
We're loading that Gulf Coast diesel onto massive product tankers that now have to undertake a grueling 40-day maritime detour across the Pacific Ocean,
40 days.
navigating around South America or crossing immense stretches of open water, specifically to avoid the contested Middle East and the highly constrained Asian shipping lanes.
A 40-day ocean journey just to deliver the baseline fuel that used to take maybe a week or two to arrive from Singapore. The sheer distance is mind-boggling.
That massive exponential increase in transit time and physical distance fundamentally alters the core economic reality of liquid fuel in Australia. To understand the financial damage, we have to deeply analyze the specific mechanism of how fuel is priced at the wholesale level.
Let's break down the IPP, the import parity pricing mechanism, because this is the exact mathematical formula that takes a naval blockade in the Middle East and converts it into a higher grocery bill for everyday citizens.
Import parity pricing is the foundational bedrock rule of the Australian fuel market. It strictly dictates that the wholesale price of fuel produced or sold domestically must directly equal the international benchmark price of that specific fuel, plus the absolute exact calculated cost of physically transporting it to Australian shores.
So the equation is rigid. The raw cost of the diesel itself on the global market, plus the maritime freight rate to move the ship, plus the specialized marine insurance premiums, plus the port docking and wharfage fees. That total equals the wholesale price at the terminal.
Exactly. And the critical variable that fluctuates in that equation is the freight and insurance. When Australia was securely relying on the relatively short Asia to Australia supply line, the shipping distances were brief.
So the freight cost was low.
The freight cost, while significant, represented a manageable, stable percentage of the total IPP equation.
But by pivoting to the U.S. Gulf Coast, we have completely abandoned the mathematics of that short supply line.
We have shifted to a massive transoceanic U.S. to Australia haul. And the research report indicates that this immense geographical shift means shipping costs don't just increase, they multiply exponentially.
Because it takes so much longer.
Yes. The supply constraints on available tankers, combined with the massive journey time, suggest freight rates for these long-haul emergency reroutes can surge by up to 10 times their normal baseline levels.
10 times the shipping cost, legally baked directly into the wholesale price of every liter under the strict ITP rules.
And this creates a chilling, inescapable, long-term macroeconomic implication. We are no longer merely dealing with a temporary spike in the raw commodity price of a barrel of oil. The commodity price could crash tomorrow, but we are looking at a permanent structural increase in the physical delivery cost of baseline energy.
A permanent inflationary floor built underneath the entire economy.
Because diesel is the literal engine of the physical economy, this massive extra logistical cost cannot be contained at the petrol pump. It bleeds into the cost structure of everything that physically moves.
When you look at a map and see a 40-day tanker detour from the Gulf Coast to Sydney, it looks like an abstract logistical headache for shipping conglomerates. But it is deeply personal.
It really is.
Think about the apple sitting in your fridge right now. The farmer utilized a diesel-powered tractor to prepare the soil and plant the tree. Another massive diesel machine harvested the apples. A heavy diesel-powered refrigerated truck drove those apples from the regional farm to a massive central distribution warehouse. Then a smaller diesel truck drove it from the warehouse to your local supermarket loading dock.
The compounding effect is massive.
At every single physical touch point, that single apple is absorbing a fraction of the cost of that 40-day Pacific tanker detour. By the time you buy it, you are paying for global maritime freight rates.
And it extends far beyond agriculture. It inflates the cost of timber for construction, the transport of clothing, the delivery of critical medical supplies to regional hospitals. The long-haul U.S. supply pivot, while absolutely vital to prevent the country from grinding to a halt, functions as a permanent structural regressive tax on household budgets.
It's brutal.
It permanently raises the baseline cost of existence.
We are paying a massive structural premium simply for the basic privilege of keeping the lights on and the supermarket shelves stocked. We traded the acute vulnerability of the Asian supply chain for the astronomical, grinding cost of the American supply chain.
It is the ultimate unavoidable price of lost industrial sovereignty. When a nation physically cannot produce what it fundamentally requires to survive, it is entirely at the mercy of global geography and volatile maritime freight rates.
Which means the country is staring down a grim horizon of permanent inflation and an ongoing geopolitical tightrope, which demands we ask the final ultimate question: what is the endgame strategy here? Australia surely cannot accept paying 10 times the shipping costs indefinitely while waiting to miraculously hit net zero in 2050. What is the actual bridge between the nightmare scenario of April 2026 and the theoretical clean energy future decades away?
The federal government is attempting to architect and execute what we can analyze as a hybrid future strategy. It is a desperate, highly complex attempt to bridge the massive temporal gap between the crisis of 2026 and the goals of 2050 without entirely bankrupting the domestic economy in the process.
And the immediate first step of that strategy seems to be throwing a massive financial lifeline to the very last, struggling remnants of the old fossil fuel system.
The immediate stopgap triage measure is the significant extension of the fuel security services payment. The government has legally committed to extending these massive financial subsidies out to the year 2030.
This mechanism is essentially the government directly paying Ampol and Viva Energy, the corporate owners of the last two domestic refineries in Queensland and Victoria, just to keep their doors open.
The government has run the risk models and recognized that allowing those last two refineries to collapse under economic pressure would push the national import dependency from 90% to a catastrophic 100%.
Which they can't afford to let happen.
Exactly. The subsidy is simply the ransom the taxpayer is now forced to pay to maintain at least a sliver of sovereign onshore refining capacity.
It's pure triage. Keep the patient's heart beating at all costs. But a subsidy isn't a long-term cure. It's just buying time.
It is entirely a bridge. And the destination that bridge is desperately trying to reach is the massive national pivot toward the domestic production of low-carbon liquid fuels, or LCLS.
The sources outline a massive $1.1 billion government capital injection into biological and renewable fuel manufacturing. And this is where the desperate survival strategy finally starts to align with the legally binding net zero climate goals.
This is the critical technological intersection. Since building massive new traditional fossil fuel refineries is both economically impossible due to Dutch disease and environmentally illegal due to net zero targets, the government is pouring a massive capital into birthing a domestic biomanufacturing sector from scratch.
Starting from zero.
Yeah. The primary goal is to produce renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel SAF onshore.
And the truly clever engineering part about this strategy is how they are utilizing those two surviving, heavily subsidized old oil refineries to kickstart it. The notes highlight a specific, highly advanced initiative at Viva's Geelong refinery. They're partnering with a massive waste management corporation called Cleanaway to engage in a chemical process called co-processing.
Co-processing is a vital transitional chemistry. Instead of feeding 100% raw fossil crude oil into the massive distillation towers and cracking units, the refinery engineers begin blending alternative biological feedstocks directly into the refining process.
Like what kind of feedstocks?
In this specific initiative, they are utilizing used cooking oil UCO.
Literally, the massive vats of degraded oil used to fry chips at industrial fast food restaurants.
Precisely the material. They aggregate massive industrial volumes of agricultural waste, animal tallows, and used cooking oil. Through advanced hydrotreating processes, adding hydrogen under massive pressure and heat to strip out the oxygen molecules from the biological oils, they process it alongside traditional crude oil.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And the resulting chemical output is a true renewable diesel.
And the absolute undeniable beauty of these specific low-carbon liquid fuels is that they are what the engineering industry categorizes as drop-in fuels.
That is the crucial defining characteristic that makes the entire strategy viable. A drop-in fuel is a synthesized hydrocarbon chain that is chemically identical or functionally near identical to traditional fossil diesel.
So you don't have to rebuild the trucks.
This means you do not need to fundamentally modify the internal combustion engines of the massive Pilbara mining trucks, or the agricultural tractors in the grain belt, or the massive long-haul freight fleet traversing the highways.
You just pump the synthesized biodiesel straight into the existing fuel tank. You bypass the massive economic hurdle of trying to convince every independent truck driver and farming conglomerate in Australia to purchase brand new, incredibly expensive, unproven electric or hydrogen rigs. You just change the chemistry of the liquid they're already purchasing at the pump.
It entirely solves the immediate infrastructure bottleneck. You utilize the massive existing distribution networks, the pipelines, the massive storage tanks, the fuel tanker trucks, the retail petrol stations, but you drastically reduce the life cycle carbon footprint of the fluid flowing through them.
So mapping out the hybrid system, we have highly efficient closed-loop micro-refineries handling the remote inland mines. We have astronomically expensive long-haul U.S. imports keeping the major urban centers alive. And we have a heavily subsidized, desperate push to co-process cooking oil into drop-in diesel at our last remaining coastal refineries.
It's quite the patchwork.
It is an incredibly complex, deeply fragile, call-together system. But what actually happens in the year 2050, when this legally binding net zero horizon finally arrives?
By 2050, the macroeconomic models project that the structural demand for liquid fuels will have changed fundamentally. The entire strategy relies heavily on the assumption that mass grid electrification will have successfully replaced the vast majority of internal combustion passenger vehicles and light commercial transport fleets.
So the millions of individual cars commuting into Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane will be fully electric, drawing power from a renewable municipal grid, entirely eliminating their niche for petrol.
That is the baseline assumption, which drastically, permanently shrinks the total volumetric demand for liquid fuel the country actually requires to function. The national demand models project a massive drop to around roughly 30 billion liters annually.
And what specific sectors are burning that remaining 30 billion liters?
The sector is defined as hard to abate or hard to electrify. This encompasses commercial aviation, heavy marine shipping, ultra-long-haul road freight, and remote, massive-scale heavy mining.
The really big stuff.
Yeah. The laws of physics dictate that you cannot realistically power a massive Boeing 747 aircraft or a 400-ton Pilbara dump truck on current battery technology. The energy density requirements, the sheer amount of megajoules required per kilogram of fuel, are simply too high for batteries.
So those massive industrial sectors will permanently require high-density liquid fuel.
They will. And the ultimate architectural goal of the 2050 strategy is that this much smaller, highly concentrated national demand of 30 billion liters will be entirely 100% supplied by a robust, mature, and sovereign onshore low-carbon liquid fuel and hydrogen industry.
Wow.
The grand vision is that imported fossil diesel will be entirely eradicated and replaced by domestically synthesized biodiesels and advanced synthetic e-fuels.
That is the light at the end of a very long, very dark tunnel. A return to sovereign energy security, but built entirely on advanced biology and synthetic chemistry, rather than drilling for heavy crude and contested waters.
That is the optimistic trajectory. But navigating the reality from the acute, paralyzing crisis of April 2026 to the theoretical promise of 2050 is going to be incredibly turbulent, structurally fragile, and, as we've analyzed deeply today, astronomically expensive for the everyday economy.
It really is a staggering, multi-layered journey we've mapped out for you today. We started with a sudden geopolitical blockade in the Middle East, a military conflict thousands of miles away that instantly exposed a 20-year macroeconomic gamble by Australian policymakers.
A huge gamble.
A deeply flawed gamble that relying on diverse Asian refineries was safe, ignoring the fact they all relied on the same single maritime choke point. We've seen how the incredible wealth generated by the mining boom, the classic Dutch disease, drove domestic wages so astronomically high that rebuilding heavy refining infrastructure became an economic impossibility.
Right.
We've seen how strict necessary environmental laws like the safeguard mechanism created a massive paradox, turning any theoretical new fossil fuel refinery into a guaranteed stranded asset.
And we've deeply examined the fascinating localized resilience of the Tarum Trough micro-refining model, stepping up for the inland mines, proving that small-scale, closed-loop supply chains can survive massive global shocks.
And we faced the brutal, everyday reality of the long-haul U.S. shipping pivot. The fact that bypassing the blocked Asian supply chain requires a 40-day oceanic detour, and that massive transit distance fundamentally bakes a permanent, exponential freight cost into the wholesale price of fuel.
Which hits the consumer directly.
It effectively acts as a permanent, regressive inflation tax on every piece of food and material the average household consumes. It is a profound, messy clash between the high wages of a resource-rich nation, the strict green laws of a climate-conscious government, and the absolute, desperate, primal need for sovereign fuel just to keep the economy from collapsing.
It represents a profound, involuntary realignment of foundational national priorities, forced entirely by external geopolitical pressure.
Before we wrap this up, you consistently have a talent for looking at these massive, complex systems and finding the hidden catch or the unseen flaw.
Oh, thanks.
We are rushing headlong toward this 2050 future, where we depend entirely on massive amounts of biomass-like industrial-used cooking oil, animal tallows, and specific agricultural waste crops to synthesize the low-carbon fuels required to power our heavy industries. What is the fundamental blind spot in that specific hybrid future?
It is a profound puzzle of circular dependency. Consider the underlying logistics. To physically produce the massive 30 billion liter volumes of low-carbon liquid fuels required to run the heavy economy in 2050, the nation will require an incredibly robust, massive-scale, highly productive agricultural sector just to grow, harvest, and aggregate all that required biological feedstock.
Right. You physically need the farmers to plant and harvest the organic material that the refineries then chemically convert into the biofuel. But here is the structural provocation to analyze. If that massive agricultural sector continues to rely heavily on heavy diesel machinery tractors, harvesters, massive transport trucks to prepare the soil, harvest the crops, and transport the very biological feedstocks needed to synthesize those alternative biofuels, are we actually escaping our systemic vulnerability?
Oh.
Or are we just shifting the bottleneck to a different location? Are we simply transferring the single point of failure from the geopolitics of the Strait of Hormuz directly to our own domestic farming supply chains, which are themselves deeply inherently vulnerable to massive droughts, catastrophic floods, and the accelerating impacts of a changing climate?
Wow. We literally need the fuel to grow the raw materials to make the fuel. If the harvest fails due to a severe drought, the fuel supply fundamentally fails. We haven't solved the vulnerability, we just traded a geopolitical risk for a massive ecological risk.
It is the ultimate, inescapable closed-loop paradox. And it is the foundational mathematical and logistical problem that every single policymaker aggressively pushing for a fully biofuel-dependent future must solve before we cross the point of no return.
That is a phenomenal, highly complex thought to leave you on. Going back to our opening analogy of the hospital, it seems we finally realized the fatal flaw of ripping out the backup generators. We are frantically trying to wire up new solar panels and advanced battery arrays while the surgeons are working by flashlight, but we just realized the sun might not shine enough to charge the batteries.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you are driving on the highway and you see one of those massive, heavy diesel freight trucks delivering goods, I highly encourage you to look twice. Recognize the incredibly fragile global machinery, the massive macroeconomic policy trade-offs, and the sheer geopolitical friction required just to keep those wheels turning and the shelves stocked. We will catch you on the next deep dive.